Hey everybody, Chris Pugh here. Just wanted to sort of go over and talk through a little bit of another mixing console process that I've really kind of gotten into and have grown to really enjoy. So right now you can probably just see me here, probably pretty pixelated on this older Apple monitor, just in monitor camera type situation, but I'm gonna hop out of that pretty soon, and I think I'll just end up being in a little window in one of the upper corners here, but just gonna kind of talk through this. So got some more content prepared. And what we're looking at today, so I can go ahead and pop this up here. There we go. All right. So what I'm referring to in this, I'm calling it hybrid mixing console system, or the incorporating of analog outboard gear and the summing into digital devices. Um, so yeah, what are we looking at here? So basically, how is this defined, or what are we calling it? Um, digital mixing console and IO. So yeah, so you've got a digital console with connected to some kind of a stage box type situation. Usually is the case for that. Um, and then we're also using console and native based processing elements, filters, etc. So we're looking at console based equalizations, dynamic processing, things like that, things that are built into the actual mix engine of any of whatever desk you're using. um Third party filters, software instances, and hosting platforms. So in my case, I'm really going to be just kind of going over and talking about how this is kind of centric and centered around the Waves Super Rack platform. And then the other part is devices connected to analog or digital connections via a converter that can closely interface with the digital mixing console. So I'll kind of go over what that looks like for me, and also maybe kind of touch on a few other examples of what can be done to incorporate some of these pieces, and some of the key things to note about that. So, looking at this, like, obviously one of the biggest questions are, what are the benefits of doing this kind of thing? Um, so what it really enables you to do is be able to have some tailor-made signal paths based off of preference and selection of analog devices. Specifically in this case, I would say things that you're not going to be able to duplicate easily or accurately in the digital domain. So maybe some things to kind of look for there in terms of maybe trying to bring a little bit of uniqueness to that regard. um Analog flavor and character to mix elements. So what we're looking at there is basically, we're talking about saturation, things like that, like, or specific types of saturation and or character that is offered by running things through real metal transformers, tubes, circuitry, and wiring that you're just not physically going to be able to duplicate in any kind of a realistic fashion using things in the software domain only. And then another big benefit, ease of access to physical mixing elements. So what we're looking at there is really the ability to, like, having that tactile element, meaning um you can always reach over and just physically turn something no matter where it is. It's never going to be nested down in any kind of a page. You don't have to pull up a rack or in a computer screen or anything like that. Everything that exists physically is sitting um, directly off to one side or in front of you, depending on how you physically laid out your deployment. So it's always just right there. You can easily reach. In my case, we're all creatures of habit, I know, in our own right. So in my case, it's always on my right hand side. I'm right handed, so that is always going to be over there on my right, to be able to reach over, grab something. As far as whether that's an EQ knob, a saturation knob, doing a reverb preset, something like that, or just a level attenuator up or down on a real potentiometer. It's always going to be over there on my right hand side. Um, And then another one is, I mean, this one is just kind of fun. It's certainly always a conversation starter when you roll into a venue or any kind of a situation and start taking your stuff out to front of house. The desk goes out there and there's always this rack. You uncap that thing and you see all these actual physical buttons with pieces that are, a little beefy. They weigh something, and, you know, always definitely kind of brings some questions into like, oh, it's like, okay, well, you've got that. Like, I'm wondering how that's being used with this, that, or the other. So, you know, if you're looking for a conversation starter, it certainly is one of those things that definitely gets the dialogue going, for good, better, or worse, depending on what kind of a situation and possibly time crunch you're in. So moving on, obviously, so there's some of the upsides. Obviously, we really need to kind of touch on what are the downsides? What are the things that can potentially bite you with this kind of thing? And it's, just having a fully open, honest conversation about this kind of a thing. It's certainly worthwhile to explore all of the types of it's worthwhile to explore, wherever we could go with this kind of a thing. So looking at that, moving on, obviously cost can get expensive very, very quickly when all the factors are considered. So we're not just talking about just the cost of the individual units themselves, but we're looking at other elements that I'll kind of dive into a little bit. But the cost of the units sometimes are prohibitive, are prohibitive in that regard. So, that's going to be one of the big points of consideration, which leads directly into weight. These units, reading directly off of it, these signature and unique pieces were always known for something that they did, but usually being light and travelable or something to that regard was typically not one of them, at least for the units that we think about when we really think about unique types of additive or character pieces. So yeah, and one piece of gear by itself may not be that much, but when you start adding things up, the reality that you're typically going to be using more than one of these type of things for the sake of getting some overall, as you're kind of crafting these things in, and then when you do kind of dive into it, like, there's just the reality of the fact that these are very, it can be a bit of a process where it's like you add one, it's like, oh, okay, well, I wonder if I could, well, what it would be like if I were to change this around or that, like, it just gets weighty very, very quickly. And then which is directly correlated with space. So thinking about the fact that, most of this stuff are the kind of things that you're going to want to put in, it's a full 19-inch rack type of a situation, or sometimes like, I'll kind of demonstrate a little bit in my case, like sometimes it's 500 series things, which are chassis that typically occupy about 3 rack units of a regular 19-inch width rack. But then you tack those things on, that space starts getting eaten up pretty quickly. And then one of the final one I've got listed here, but certainly not one to overlook, troubleshooting. So basically the reality is, it's like, rather than something being a piece of software, anything that potentially made it kind of cool, flavorful, hip, whatever kind of adjective you want to use to describe there, we're looking at pieces that may not necessarily be known for being incredibly roadworthy. So if you're talking about carting these things and bouncing them down the road hundreds, thousands of miles at a time or something like that, it's something to consider, which also adds in when you do this. All of these things, these points will very easily lead right into one another. Like, you want to be able to safely cart this stuff around depending on what your travel tour situation looks like. That often translates directly into, well, in order to be able to do that safely, like, you're going to add weight because your case needs to be this much beefier, or this, that, or the other. Or the fact of the matter, if something does happen, it does get bounced down the road a little bit, and now you're at a point of like, oh, well, this happened, this thing got jiggled, I had a power cable come loose, I've got maybe a tube that needs to be reseated. All of that kind of stuff comes into play with the whole troubleshooting. And you typically might want to be prepared with a couple of screwdrivers, driver drills, something like that, just to be ready, because it's not ultimately, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to have to dive in there and at least take a look at something, even if it's not a total showstopper. But just have the ability and the potential patience and ready to have to dive in and see what's going on with this, that, or the other. All right. So looking at the next pieces, like, just as far as kind of the overall components that we're looking at here. So what are the main things that we need to deploy when it comes to this kind of stuff? So, we're looking at trying to get things as robust as possible on the front end. So a solid digital mixing console system, ideally something that has some options when it comes to input and output types of capacity with interface. So in my case, Digico SD9 with an SD rack. That's my primary, that's the baseline, that's the core of it. So, I think it's pretty safe to say, in terms of just an industry standard thing, that both of those components could easily be described as, at least reasonable, quality grade, industry standard, accepted pieces that, like, okay, yeah, no, that's a really good baseline to start from. All right. And then going in for the digital instance hosting, reliable, again, repeating some of these type of descriptors here, reliable, industry proven interface for hosting filters plugins. So what I'm looking at in this case, pretty much the most straight ahead point to point type of a interface method. I use the term point to point just in terms of the actual interface cards. So we're looking at that. In this case it's just a factory fit card that fits directly into the console chassis, and server system with that. In my case, I'm using 2 Extreme servers. For my instance hosting, I don't have anything that's really causing me to go over the workload of 1 Extreme server. Typically on the session that I'm running right now, I'm running that server at about 30 to 31% capacity. So my pair of Extreme servers that I'm using, I'm running them in primary redundant mode. There's no need for me to use the function. It is nice that Waves does offer the use of up to 4 servers that can work in tandem with one another now. However, it's not really applicable in my case. I'm just happy to be able to have the multiple servers for the sake of a redundant option in case one of them were to have a critical failure, the other one takes over. Is going to be a little bit of an audio lag in that, but just having the redundancy there is just good peace of mind. All right, so that's talking about the core, a method of interface for software instances, and now getting into kind of what we're really looking at here as far as the actual analog component integrations. Simple answer, you need a converter, ideally something that is going to closely integrate with your console. So what did I put here? Yeah, in my case, I'm using the Apogee Symphony Mark II SoundGrid enabled device. The way I have it set up, it has 2 module card slot options, and with those, you've got a few different options that you can use as far as what kind of module slots are in there. They all work off of, for analog IO, it's all DB25 connectors for the line level IO on the analog side. And for the module cards that have AES, as an additional AES IO slot, you can use the same DB25 on this particular converter. It is the Yamaha pinout, so that's critical to remember in terms of that particular type of converter. Not all of them are like that. A lot of the other modern types of AES IO over DB25 are the Tascam pinout. So if you're using a Symphony, it's Yamaha. A lot of the other things are Tascam. It's just something to be aware of. certainly a quick lesson I learned when I had a shorter Tascam pinout one in there and installed it for the first time, and was just wondering like, why aren't my AES-IO doing what they're supposed to? And then just reading a quick little note to say like, oh, yep, I had that wrong. So these are the components for that. Going into just a quick little reason for why I chose this route on this particular system. So because of the fact that if you look at the middle point here, looking at for the software based plugin host um, type of a interface, which is Super Rack, that is a very integrated system because of how it all connects to one another via a small contained SoundGrid network, which SoundGrid is it's a layer 2 IP based protocol, very low latency for this type of an application for both hosting software things, and I'm tacking off of it to utilize some of the analog things. It really is almost tailor made for this kind of application. I like it a lot, and not to say it's the only way, because there are a lot of times where you may have another console system that has other more universal and possibly greater quantities of IO ports available. Say, seen something recently where I think this is how it gets done a lot in some of the other consoles that have more standardized but higher counts of physical of different types of digital interface on their chassis. So let's look at like maybe an Avid S6L or something. One of the card slots that's available in that is the MADI 192 card. I think that's what it's called, but it's a MADI IO device that can easily accommodate, depending on your cabling scheme, up to 64 inputs and outputs on a MADI stream. And you connect that. And in fact, it may even be double that. Not quite sure. It may actually be up to 128 based off of whatever kind of cabling scheme that you have in play. So a lot of times you can take that and connect it directly to a variety of different MADI converters to analog line IO on that. There's a few that are made out there. As far as preference on that, direct out, it tends to be something that I would usually favor as kind of a preferable choice there. There's also some made by Ferrofish. RME has a few, just several options, and that in many cases maybe that's the better choice in the way to do that. I know some people have also done this both with not just Avid S6, but in the Digico domain, just using a second stage rack. So like in an Avid realm, maybe a stage 32, stage 16, depending on how much you're using. Maybe another stage 64. I don't know. Digico, I've also seen people use a lot of native IO for that too. A small SD rack like the SD mini rack or micro rack, depending on what it is. Especially if you're already working in an opticore loop situation, sometimes those are the most straightforward things to do. I do it this way because it's, for all intents, it's kind of what I had available, and it was the most. I've owned this particular Symphony chassis for quite some time, and it was just kind of the best way for me to kind of go about it. So moving on, what are some of the options that we have when being able to when starting to incorporate some of this stuff? So this is where the palette gets really vast as far as what you can do. So some of the main things we're looking at, you've got analog inserts on some of the key or important inputs where you want more than what's offered in digital instance domain. So if you want to be able to have some analog tactile control on certain types of inputs, a lead vocal, maybe something that's very, very present, very forward in your mix, anything like that, to be able to treat those uniquely and be able to do that outside of the box and have an easy tactile handle on that. Another one are hardware reverb units, whether they are analog IO or oftentimes they will actually have digital connections as well, because in terms they are essentially digital devices. But where this really comes in handy too is that we all know that in a software-based domain, reverbs, especially good reverbs, are often very, very heavy-handed on server processing. If we're talking about like a Waves reverb or something like that, those are going to start chewing up cycles and utilize server processing horsepower very, very quickly if they're done well. So units that are dedicated to their own process for that kind of thing can come in very, very handy. And for that matter too, a lot of particular reverb units have a signature piece or a signature type of a sound that we're going for that sometimes is not the most authentic or easy to create in the software domain. And then let's see, external dynamics EQs that have certain signatures and offer tactile control, that kind of goes right in with the first point there. But you know, so key things, or if you want to maybe use that in some group processing or something like that, that can kind of come in handy, which that leads kind of directly into this one of the analog summing for submixing, or basically spitting out either individual group level things or stems of groups. Any desk that can offer some kind of a group to group function really kind of enables you to make a stem group, essentially, which is, a lot of times is how we would refer to it in maybe the studio domain of where you're sort of spitting out stems and then kind of mixing from there a lot of times, depending on what kind of a session you're working on, rather, whether you're working from the original source multi-tracks or sometimes at that other level. But by doing these things in stems, obviously we can kind of make, we get that count a little bit lower, meaning the actual points of interface in terms of the analog IO, obviously that it gets that number to come down quite a bit. So moving on, of these type of options, what am I doing? So put it simply, without going into all the detail of it, some combination of all of those. So let's take a look at the overview of kind of what I've got going on. So here is the front of house mix position deployed at a recent-ish show. I've made a couple of internal modifications after this point, but as far as the physical side of it, it pretty much looks like this right here. So you see you've got the console there, Ergotron monitor arm holding that see if I can use my mouse here to kind of highlight some of this stuff. So this piece here, this is that's the Axis One host computer that's running the host of Super Rack there. These are the two servers. They are both Extreme servers. You do notice they look a little bit different. That's because this top one is actually a version 2. This is a version 3. It basically is just a matter of when I ended up purchasing those units. And this unit has, I've had it for a long time. This is the V2 on top. It's never done me wrong or really exhibited any potential issues. So I haven't had a need or a want to get rid of it. Same thing with this one here. It's a version 3. Technically, I guess it has a little bit more horsepower in it. But again, speaking to the fact that I'm really only using one or the other of these units and only using about 30 to 31% of their available processing horsepower, not really worried about maxing that out, at least in terms of that. One of the reasons I'm so low on processing horsepower is not every single input is stacked up with a bunch of plugins on it. And a lot of that whole ability and reasoning comes from the fact that I'm able to offload a lot of that stuff over here. So looking at some of these things, just quick overview, this, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units here are, that's basically the analog vocal chain for my primary lead vocal on this file. This one unit here directly after that is a single mono send return subharmonic synthesizer. So this is the DBX 510. It's basically the 500 series version of a rack mount old DBX 120X, I think is the name of it. Next to that, we get into the 500 version of the AMS Neve RMX 16. So this is obviously the 500 rack version of it. It pins in and out in the exact same way that the old one, that the original 2RU unit did. So it's mono in, stereo out. And that is really a very, very signature sounding piece. I use it mainly on its non-lens settings. but it's you know, I can definitely say because of the signature sound to it, pretty much no matter what preset you use or what settings you dial in on it, it's pretty much always going to sound like that. Moving down here, straight across, full 19-inch rack 1 RU unit, Lexicon PCM 92, which I'm using for very obvious sounding um, drum reverbs and things like that. Below that is the Neve 5059 summing mixer. I'm going to kind of get into some of the details on that at a later date. So, and then coming out of the one of the stereo buses out of this guy, going into this unit, which is a unit by GainLab Audio called the Dictator. It's a 2RU Varimu compressor, so it is tube staged, and it behaves very much like a Varimu. So you can really dive hard into it and not get that. It's not going to do the little pumping thing like a really fast VCA or even some of the other optos out there. So, and then going from that into out of that into this Sonic Farm piece, which I've really come to like and enjoy quite a bit. And just every time I turn it on or bypass it, I'm just like, I don't see how I ever did this stuff without that. It's a very unique piece. And you know, primary, you can put it in either pentode or triode type of saturation. On the tube side, it does have an input attenuator that allows you to drive the tubes less hard if you want to, without reducing the level. It's just a matter of personal preference on that. And then after that, it does have these little white buttons here are indicative of a very Pultec-ish type of an EQ. And there's a couple of switches on what the corner frequency on a shelf would be for, say, the low side or the high side. Below that, one open space. Thinking about that a little bit for the time being, that may just stay open, or I don't know. For right now, I don't have anything else that I really have a huge want or need to want to put in there. Below that is this little 2-rack space unit. This is a Teagler Audio tube stage stereo reverb engine that I've been using on lead vocal for a couple of reasons. It sounds really fantastic, and it also has these really big, very simple to operate knobs that are also on motorized servos. It would be simple enough for me to reach down and change some basic properties that would really be able to, I could actually get that pretty easily. But another thing I like about it is that it actually has a web-based, web server-based control protocol. I've got an available port here in this system that enables me to basically recall a software instance GUI of the unit, and I've got about 5 different reverb presets already built out that I can basically just kind of page through based off of what kind of lead vocal reverb I need. And then I've got the converter underneath that, which I was going to kind of go over to this next one and really kind of outline sort of what the face of that looks like. So right here, I've got it on, but not any signal running through it, but you can basically tell. So there's my 24 inputs, 24 outputs. That's on the analog side. And then here in the digital domain, these smaller dots are indicative of AES or digital input and output. So that's the totality of input and output, and that connects to that whole super rack ecosystem. So on this next one here, just kind of another little piece side by side on that. You can see a little bit more on the summing element here. So that's the 5059, and the way that I'm using it right now is basically it does have 2 stereo buses on it, and I'm using both of them as well as all 16 summing inputs. I kind of want to hold on this a little bit right now and maybe just kind of stop here, because I'd like to take maybe another one of these and go a little bit deeper into exactly what's going on with some of that summing process, because I don't have enough of additional rack space to actually use the analog inserts that are available via the process of the summing units, and that would basically either mean another rack and a lot more investment into it, which may happen at some point in time. But for the time being, I'm keeping some of the actual processing for these, and they are labeled here in groups. So you can notice where I have some of the pairs labeled pan, hard, left, right, and then I'm using a few things. So it's basically all stereo. The first 8 are stereo, 9, 10 are another stereo. That's BGV. It's kind of hard to see there. But then 11 and 12, they are mono, so pan straight up and down center. That is, so this one is the bass mono bass guitar group output, and this one is the mono lead vocal right here, followed by a couple of others that are back in stereo. So vocal effects and then drum effects. And then those from there are assigned respectively to either stereo bus 1 or stereo bus 2. So for the time being, this is the band bus. So that's basically everything that's not a vocal. That's from here. It's getting silk blue saturation. And then this is the vocal. Actually moving back here real quick. So silk blue saturation going into the dictator, into the creamliner, straight out into another set of converters where I merge it back into a bus on the console. Vocal is coming straight out, not going through anything. That's kind of another thought for like, do I want to put it through something else? For the time being, the way I'm listening and the way I'm hearing it, I'm not hearing that it really needs much else after the fact. But for the time being, so that's just getting pushed out there. So that's all the vocals. That's the mono lead vocal, stereo background vocals, stereo vocal effects, all getting routed to stereo bus 2, red silk applied, and then push straight back into another set of converter inputs, and then those come to a vocal bus. So basically I have 2 master faders essentially on the console. So the other side is I am actually coming back and having to go back into the console for that, just for the sake of flexibility in terms of being able to do that and not have to worry about an external matrix drive process, something I might explore later on. So I think moving on from here, really, I think I'd already kind of verbally talked over some of these things. So yeah, analog lead vocal chain, subharmonic synthesizer, nonlinear reverb, lexicon reverb unit, doing kind of the obvious longer type of drum reverbs, summing, the Verimu, and the let's see, lead vocal reverb that, yeah, it's kind of hard to see in this particular one because it's kind of cut off there, but we saw it in one of the other photos. Tube saturation EQ, that's the creamliner there. So that's pretty much it as far as that side. And I think I'm going to stop right there and maybe look at going into some more detailed elements in the summing process, because that's where I'm doing sort of this bit of a hybrid thing that allows me to use some of the feature sets available on the Neve and the converter in tandem with one another, along with the software elements that I'm still able to take advantage of in terms of some group processing on these and a little bit of tone shaping without having to go completely outside the box for that, which maybe that's a goal at some point in time. But for the time being, I'm really liking just, being able to keep all this stuff in a single rack. And as you could probably tell, we go back over to some of our advantages and disadvantages. Even as it is right now, this thing is not light, especially for a moderate level type of a situation. This rack easily weighs over 300 pounds, and you know uh certainly mindful to keep some tools on the standby just in case something ever gets jostled or you hear something that needs to be addressed. But anyway, that's kind of what's going on there. Didn't talk about a lot of the other, console files or anything, or structure, recording process, anything, but it all definitely exists in there. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to sort of catch up on what I'm doing there. Hopefully this might kind of shed some light on some of the answers in terms of what this stuff, like how all this stuff glues together, and kind of how I'm utilizing it to ultimately kind of make an overall mix and work with it. So hope you're all doing well and have a good rest of your day. Cheers.